Before we begin, I just want to warn you that this video will contain spoilers. Not just for Kingdom Hearts 3, but for the entire Kingdom Hearts series. You've been warned. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Kingdom Hearts series, it's a series of action RPG games with a very simple premise: to combine the worlds of Final Fantasy and the worlds of classic Disney movies. If that sounds awesome, it's because it is. Who wouldn't want to team up with their favorite Final Fantasy and Disney characters and fight against the forces of evil? The first game in the series, released in 2002, for the most part lived up to that premise. After his world has been destroyed by darkness, our main character, Sora, teams up with Goofy and Donald and must travel between various Disney worlds to rescue his friends and prevent other worlds from suffering the same fate as his. On these adventures, you'll face Giant Dragon Maleficent, you'll go head-to-head against Cloud and Sephiroth, you'll learn magic from Merlin, and you'll team up with Sid to improve your gummy ship. While it wasn't a perfect game, it was a fun enough game with an interesting enough premise, and it was well received by both fans and critics. For this reason, it was no surprise that a sequel was released only a few short years later. This game mostly followed the same formula as the original, with some additional improvements. The combat system was improved, and additional playable characters such as Roxas and even Mickey Mouse were added. This game was also more ambitious in the types of worlds that they let players explore. Branching out from traditional animated films, this game allowed players to explore the gritty oceans of the Caribbean, the glowing computer world of Tron, and even the rubber hose-inspired land of early Disney cartoons. Looking back with hindsight, you can already see the beginnings of some of the problems that would plague the series later on. While the story wasn't impossible to follow, it did expect players to have already played not only the original game, but the mobile spin-off Chain of Memories as well. It also introduced a large number of new enemies. While the original game only had the Heartless, this game not only introduced a new group of enemies known as the Nobodies, but they introduced an entire organization of villains called Organization 13. This game not only retconned the original game by changing the identity of the character known as Ansem, but it also begins to downplay the role of Final Fantasy characters in the series, in favor of their own original cast of characters. However, despite these issues, it was still a very well-received and popular game, and a sequel seemed inevitable. Until it didn't. As the years passed, players, including myself, kept waiting to hear information on more games in the mainline series. But time after time, all we got were mobile spin-offs and remakes. We got 358 over 2 days, Dream Drop Distance, and a collection of games that, I kid you not, is called Kingdom Hearts HD 2.8 Final Chapter Prologue, which features a game called Kingdom Hearts 0.2 Birth by Sleep, a Fragmentary Passage. And yet through all this, we still didn't get Kingdom Hearts 3. Over time, it became one of those mythical games that you hear rumors about, but you never really believe will actually come out, like Half-Life 3 or Duke Nukem Forever. Even after they showed a trailer at E3 2013, I still didn't believe that this game was going to come out. And it took another 6 years to finally be released. But in January of 2019, the moment finally arrived. After 13 long years of waiting, the game that we'd all been waiting for was finally here! And it was terrible! Before I jump into all of the ways and reasons why I think this game sucked, I want to address some concerns that some of you might have. First, I want to begin by saying that I'm actually a huge fan of this series, and I was really excited to play this game. Any concerns or criticisms I might have about it are not coming from the perspective of a troll who's trying to tear down the series, but rather from the position of a fan who waited 13 years for this game and was sincerely disappointed by the end result. Secondly, one common rebuttal I hear to criticism about this game is the idea that if this would have come out sooner, perhaps in 2009, I would have been happy with it. And that's entirely valid. If this game would have come out a reasonable amount of time after the first game, I probably would have loved it. And in fact, that's a part of the problem. Now, I'm not going to criticize this game for how long it took to come out. Sometimes you have to wait for things, and that's all just part of the deal. However, one of the big problems with this game is it does feel like a game that could have come out in 2009. Players have different expectations in the year 2019, and I was looking forward to seeing how this game would evolve and keep up with the times, but it never really did. Finally, in response to any discussion of this game's flaws, it's easy to simply point out all of the improvements that Kingdom Hearts 3 actually made over previous games in the series. And I'm not going to stand here and try to argue that this game did nothing right. In a lot of ways, it actually did improve over past entries in the series, on a technical level. As expected of a game that came out 13 years since their last major console entry, this game makes a number of technical improvements over previous games. The graphics are far improved, the worlds are much larger and don't have those annoying load times, and there's much more room for visual spectacle. Underneath all of the blinking lights, however, is a boring, convoluted, and soulless husk of a game that seems to have forgotten what players love about the series in the first place. Let's start off with the first and most obvious criticism against this game: the story. Since Kingdom Hearts 2 came out, there have basically been about a half a dozen new entries in the series, depending on how you want to count, and this game expects that you've played all of them. It constantly throws characters and plot points from previous games at you with little to no explanation. And even when it does provide an explanation, it's usually so convoluted that you still have no idea what's going on. I actually picked up the HD remakes and replayed through them in preparation of this game, and there were even points when I had no idea what was happening. There are kids who were not born when Kingdom Hearts 2 came out that are playing this game for the first time, and I cannot imagine how confused they must be.
We have discussed this before, Sora. Your Mark of Mastery exam was conducted in the hopes you would acquire the power to wake them.
So this is the place where Aqua fell into the realm of darkness after she dove in to save Terra.
If alternate us knew Roxas, then maybe alternate other folks did too.
You knew him as Vexen, but to us, he was Ansem's apprentice, Evan. He was recompleted like the rest of us.
Oh, yeah, the log terminal.
You don't know what he said.
His empty body stayed in the present, took the name Xemnas, and founded Organization 13.
I know I haven't got a clue.
However, this flaw is pretty forgivable, since pretty much everyone besides Tetsuya Nomura seems to realize that players don't play these games for the story. They play them for the awesome Disney Final Fantasy action, which on the surface this game seems to revive. Although it didn't include the Avengers or Star Wars worlds that many fans speculated about, it does take advantage of the intervening 13 years to introduce players to some brand new worlds in the Disney universe. These include Tangled's Kingdom of Corona, Frozen's Kingdom of Arendelle, and the Pixar worlds of Monsters Incorporated and Toy Story. It even includes San Francisco from Big Hero 6. In addition to these brand new worlds, this game also takes us back to some fan-favorite worlds from previous games, including Winnie the Pooh's 100 Acre Woods and Mount Olympus from Hercules. However, with a few exceptions, These worlds all feel pretty hollow, and seem to have lost the spark of life that made previous games in the series so fun to play. First off, while we were introduced to some interesting new worlds in the Disney universe, the Final Fantasy half of this Final Fantasy Disney crossover seems to have fallen by the wayside. I'm not saying they put it on the back burner or downplayed the role of the Final Fantasy characters. I'm saying that they seem to be removed entirely. I cannot remember interacting with a single Final Fantasy character in this entire game, and that's literally half the premise for this series. Secondly, the Disney worlds themselves fell a little flat for me. They seemed bland, uninspired, and lacking in heart. This can be felt in several areas, from the level design to the storylines, and especially in the boss fights. The Disney stories in this game seem to have two speeds. Side story that doesn't really affect anything, and playing the entire movie on fast forward. Take the Monsters Inc. world, for instance. In this world, Goofy, Donald, and Sora team up with Mike and Sully from Monsters Incorporated and run around the factory trying to find Boo's door. You fight a bunch of enemies, but at the end of the day, nothing really happens. Then there's the other side of the spectrum, where they try to cram an entire movie's worth of story into a single level while barely showing you any of it. To its credit, the Tangled world, which is one of the first worlds that players play through in this game, actually did a pretty good job with this. Goofy, Sora, and Donald actually travel with Rapunzel as she goes through the major plot points of the story. You actually get to know Rapunzel a little bit as a character, and the story is easy to follow, hitting all the major points without feeling too rushed. However, I would say that this world is an outlier. Other worlds, such as the Pirates of the Caribbean world or the Frozen world, flash scenes from the movies in front of your face fast enough to give you whiplash without nearly enough context to understand what's going on. Not only do they expect you to have played every game in the series, but they also expect you to have seen a dozen Disney movies, because if you haven't seen the movies, you're going to have no idea who these characters are or why anything is happening. Well, it's easy to argue that the games have always been this way. I'd say that that's actually not the case. In previous entries in the series, Sora would often be dropped in the middle of the action and play through a few key moments from the movies instead of trying to cram the entire plot into a single level. Take the Tarzan world, for instance, from the first game. When Sora arrives on the scene, Tarzan and Jane already know each other and are spending time in the camp together. We don't have to learn about Tarzan's childhood or how he met Jane. All we have to learn is their current situation, and we go from there. We find out that Clayton is trying to hunt gorillas. We stop him, fight him, and move on to the next world. Or take the Alice in Wonderland world. Similar story. We don't follow the entire story of Alice in Wonderland. We actually pick up towards the end, when Alice is captured by the Queen of Hearts and is on trial. Sora, Donald, and Goofy have to search for evidence to free Alice. We fight the Queen, we fight another boss, and we move on to the next world. Occasionally, if the games wanted to tell a larger story, they could break it into pieces, allowing players to revisit worlds to wrap up the story at a later point in the game. Not only did this game never once ask you to revisit a world, but I'm almost glad that they didn't, because the worlds were so boring that if they had asked me to go back, I wouldn't have wanted to. Gameplay-wise, this game was pretty bland as well. A vast majority of the game consists of combat, and while the combat system does provide you with a large variety of options, including multiple keyblades with different powers, magic spells, flow motion attacks which allow players to use the environment to their advantage in battle, the ability to summon amusement park rides to attack your enemies, and even the ability to summon Disney characters to come to your aid, all of these options still left the combat feeling repetitive and boring. none of the fights actually provide any kind of challenge, so players aren't incentivized to really explore and master the combat mechanics the same way they were in a game like Kingdom Hearts 2. Most of those extra combat options that I mentioned simply turned into annoying cutscenes and mini-games that players would rather avoid. At the end of the day, most combat encounters ended up devolving to basic button mashing and felt very mindless and repetitive. However, the worst part of all is the boss fights. The Kingdom Hearts series has had some incredible and iconic boss fights throughout its history. From Dragon Maleficent, to facing evil Riku, to facing a giant Ursula wielding a trident, to epic multi-stage final boss battles. There are three characteristics that mark some of the best boss fights from this series' history. First, most of them are iconic Disney villains that we already know, such as Oogie Boogie, Jafar, and the Queen of Hearts. Two, they often have a massive sense of scale. One of my favorite things about previous boss fights is how huge they could get. Often these giant boss battles completely change the field of the battle and make you rethink your strategy in entirely new ways. 3. Many of the best boss battles throughout the series force players to come up with unique and interesting strategies to approach the bosses, more than just hit them a bunch of times until they die. This is one area I thought Kingdom Hearts 3 would do great in, as the very first world has you fighting a giant, iconic villain from Disney history, the Titans from Disney's Hercules. However, after this fight, not only do you never fight another giant boss in the entire game, but you actually never fight another Disney villain. Can you imagine that? A Final Fantasy Disney crossover with no Final Fantasy and no Disney villains. And the worst part is, pretty much none of these boss fights require any kind of unique strategy. You just hit them a bunch until they die. Which takes a while, since most of these bosses seem to have about 20 bars of health. Don't get me wrong, the boss fights aren't difficult in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I think there are only 2 bosses in the entire game that took me more than a single try to defeat. However, while they may not be difficult, they still take forever. At the end of the day, this game isn't the worst thing I've ever played. However, not only does it not live up to 13 years of expectation, it doesn't even match the joy and wonder of the previous entries in the series. The fights are boring, and there are way too many of them. The story is long and impossibly convoluted, and it doesn't even follow through on the core premise of the series, being a Final Fantasy Disney crossover. For this reason, I give Kingdom Hearts 3 2 Inkies out of 5. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel for more game design videos. I'm still a pretty new channel as well, so if you could like this video and possibly share it with a friend, I'd really appreciate it, and it would really help us grow. I know my posting schedule is still a bit up in the air, so if you don't want to wait for the next video, you can always follow me on the Rempton Games blog. I post there every week, and there's over 100 posted articles for you to catch up on.